They promised the bus would take me to the hotel. Instead, I woke to the smell of bleach and fear. My worn leather purse was still clutched in my hands, its strap a snake of familiar comfort around my wrist. It felt like the last proof I existed. I remembered the parking lot, the harsh afternoon sun glinting off the windshields. My daughter, Lynn, had kissed my cheek, a quick, dry peck that landed closer to my ear than my mouth. Her smile was a thin, brittle thing, stretched tight across her face while her eyes darted to the phone in her hand, always the phone. "The bus will drop you right at the hotel, Mom," she'd said, her voice bright and false. She'd hefted my floral suitcase, the one I'd had for 20 years, and pushed it toward the bus driver with an air of finality before hurrying back to her car, a silver SUV that cost more than my first house. She didn't look back. I had found a seat by the window, watching the familiar landscape of my life blur into a smear of greens and grays. I'd felt a prickle of unease, a small, insistent whisper that I'd pushed down, labeling it as nerves. A new chapter, Lynn had called it, a chance for me to have a little vacation at a lovely extended stay hotel while she and her husband, Mark, did some necessary renovations on the house. My house. The one I'd lived in for 40 years, the one where I'd raised her, nursed her through chicken pox, and waited up for her on prom night. They had moved in with me 3 years ago, after Mark's business venture failed. "Just for a little while, Mom," Lynn had promised, "just until we get back on our feet." 3 years is a long little while. The steady hum of the road, the gentle, rocking sway of the bus seat. It must have lulled me to sleep. I'd been so tired lately. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep never seemed to touch. I remember leaning my head against the cool glass of the window, the vibration a strange sort of comfort. Then, nothing. A deep, dreamless void. Now, this. This wasn't the gentle hum of a hotel lobby or the scent of complimentary coffee. The air was sharp, acrid with the smell of industrial disinfectant and something else, something metallic and vaguely human, like stale sweat and sorrow. The light was dim, fluorescent, and cold, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. I pushed myself up on my elbows, my joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans. I wasn't on a plush hotel bed. I was on a narrow metal cot, the mattress no thicker than a yoga mat. Around me, in the cavernous, echoing space, were rows upon rows of identical cots. Most were occupied by women, curled in on themselves like frightened snails, their faces turned to the wall. A few sat upright, their eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of confusion. My suitcase. The floral one with the slightly sticky wheel. It was gone. I fumbled in my purse, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely work the clasp. My wallet was there, my driver's license, a few crumpled dollar bills. But my phone, my lifeline to the world, to Lynn, was gone. And so, I understood with a certainty that settled like a block of ice in my stomach, was the hotel. This wasn't a vacation. This was something else entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat, a whimper that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the room. I looked at the faces around me, the silent, shrouded forms, and saw the reflections of my own dawning horror. This wasn't a mistake. It was a destination. A woman on a nearby cot stirred, her face a road map of wrinkles and hardship. She looked at me, not with pity, but with a weary, knowing resignation. "First night?" she rasped, her voice like gravel. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You'll get used to the smell," she said, before rolling over to face the wall again, leaving me alone with the bleach and the fear. And a question that screamed in the silence of my mind: why? Why would Lynn do this? The memory of her stiff smile, her averted eyes, played over and over in my mind, each repetition twisting the knife of betrayal a little deeper. The bus ride wasn't a ride to a hotel. It was a delivery. The first night was a descent into a specific kind of hell I never knew existed. It was a symphony of quiet desperation. The rhythmic creak of cots as women shifted restlessly, the soft, muffled sobs that would start in one corner of the room and be answered by another, a sad, lonely echo. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the unsaid, the endured, the lost. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling despair. I lay on my back, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles, each crack and discoloration a new continent on a map of misery. My mind refused to be quiet. It raced, replaying every conversation I'd had with Lynn in the last month, searching for a clue, a sign that I had missed. "The hotel is wonderful, Mom. It has a pool, and a little kitchenette in the room. You'll be so comfortable," she'd said, scrolling through pictures on her phone, pictures she never actually showed me. "Mark and I just need the space to get the contractors in. Dust everywhere. You'd hate it." It had sounded so reasonable, so considerate. I had felt a pang of guilt for even questioning it, for the small voice that whispered, "Why can't I just stay in my room?" I had silenced that voice, as I had silenced so many of my own needs over the years, for the sake of peace, for the sake of my daughter's happiness. A woman coughed nearby, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake her entire frame. I listened to the murmurs that filled the vast, dark room. They weren't conversations, not really. They were fragments, pieces of lives shattered and swept into this forgotten corner. "He said he loved me, right up until he changed the locks." A voice whispered into the darkness. "The medical bills they just ate everything." Another choked out. "My son, he has a new family now. No room for his old mother." Each story was a quiet tragedy, a testament to being deemed disposable. I heard my own story in their whispers. I wasn't unique. I was just the newest member of a club no one ever wanted to join. The realization that this wasn't a mistake, that this was intentional, landed not like a sudden blow but like a slow, seeping poison. A mistake would have involved frantic phone calls, apologies, a taxi screeching to a halt outside. There was only silence. The cold, calculated silence of abandonment. Lynn hadn't just put me on the wrong bus. She had put me on this bus, the one destined for this place, this warehouse of forgotten women. She had signed a paper, told a lie, and driven away, leaving my life in her rearview mirror. In the morning, a clanging bell startled me from a fitful, dream-haunted doze. The lights flickered on, mercilessly bright, revealing the full scope of the place. It was an old gymnasium, the lines for basketball courts still faintly visible under the scuffed linoleum. The women began to move with a practiced, weary routine, folding their thin blankets, smoothing their lumpy pillows. There was no chatter, just the rustle of clothing and the soft shuffle of slippered feet. I watched them, feeling like a ghost, an observer in my own nightmare. We were herded into a line that snaked towards a serving counter. A woman with a hairnet and a permanent scowl slapped a ladle of grayish oatmeal into a plastic bowl and handed me a plastic spoon. The coffee was watery and bitter, but it was hot. I found a space at a long folding table, my movements stiff and uncertain. The other women ate with a grim efficiency, their eyes downcast. I tried to eat, but the oatmeal tasted like paste, and my throat was closed with a knot of grief and rage. I saw the woman from the cot next to mine. She was older than me, perhaps in her late 70s, with hands gnarled by arthritis but a spine that was ramrod straight. She caught my eye and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't friendly, not exactly. It was a nod of acknowledgement. "I see you. I know." For the first time since waking up in this place, I didn't feel entirely alone. I felt seen in my terror. I spent the day in a daze, watching the routines of this strange new world. There was a television bolted to the wall in a corner, playing a game show at a volume that was just a little too loud. Some women watched it with a rapt, desperate intensity. Others sat alone, knitting or reading from a sparse collection of dog-eared paperbacks. I saw no joy, no laughter. I only saw the art of passing time, of enduring one moment to get to the next. The full weight of what Lynn had done pressed down on me, a physical pressure in my chest. She hadn't just gotten rid of me. She had erased me. By taking my phone, she had taken my voice. By taking my suitcase, she had taken my identity, the familiar clothes and small trinkets that made me me. She had stripped me down to this, a frightened old woman in a shelter, clutching a worn leather purse. And as I sat there, listening to the canned laughter from the television and the quiet coughing of the woman next to me, I understood that the first night was just the beginning. The real test would be surviving the days. A cold, hard knot of resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. They could take my home, my phone, my belongings. But there was one thing I wouldn't let them have. I wouldn't let them have my spirit. Not without a fight. The question was, how do you fight when you have nothing left? The payphone was mounted on a wall near the bathrooms, its metal cord thick and gray like a dead snake. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. It became my sanctuary and my tormentor. Finding a quarter was the first hurdle. I had to ask one of the shelter supervisors, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, who sighed and dug one out of a little tin box as if it were a piece of her own soul. The coin felt heavy and precious in my palm. My fingers trembled as I punched in Lynn's number, a sequence I knew better than my own birthday. I pressed the cold plastic receiver to my ear, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It rang. Once. Twice. Hope, fragile and foolish, fluttered in my chest. On the fourth ring, it went to voicemail. Lynn's voice, cheerful and professionally brisk, filled my ear. "Hi, you've reached Lynn Matheson. I can't get to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a great day." A great day. The irony was a physical blow. Lynn? Lynn, honey, it's Mom. My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat, trying to sound calm, normal. There's been a terrible mistake. The bus. It didn't go to the hotel. I'm at some kind of place. A shelter. Please, honey, you have to call me back. I don't have my phone. The number here is. I had to turn and look at the number printed on a yellowed piece of paper taped above the phone. I read it out slowly, twice. Please call. I'm scared. I hung up, my hands shaking. The first hour of waiting was the worst. Every time the door to the main room opened, I flinched, expecting to see Brenda coming to tell me I had a call. She never came. I replayed my message in my head. Did I sound too frantic? Too demanding? Should I have pretended everything was okay, just asked a casual question? The calculus of a mother trying not to be a burden to her child, even in the midst of a catastrophe she had created, was a deeply ingrained, sickening instinct. I waited until the afternoon and tried again. This time, I had to trade one of the crumpled dollar bills from my purse for 4 quarters from the woman I now knew as May, the one from the cot next to mine. She looked at me with those knowing eyes, her expression unreadable. "Don't expect much," she said, her voice flat, as she dropped the coins into my hand. This time, the phone rang only twice before clicking to voicemail. "Lynn," I began again, the forced calm in my voice already cracking. "It's Mom again. I haven't heard from you. I really need you to call me. This isn't funny. I don't know where I am, exactly. It's called the Serenity House. Please, Lynn. Just call." The silence that followed was louder than any noise. It was a silence filled with intention. A simple miscommunication is fixed with a phone call. This was something else. This was a door being deliberately, firmly closed in my face. Days began to blur into a monotonous cycle of tasteless meals and endless waiting. Each day, I made the pilgrimage to the payphone. My messages became more desperate. "Lynn, for God's sake, what is happening? Are you getting these messages? Mark, if you're hearing this, please, have her call me. Your mother needs you." Then, pleading. "Honey, if I did something wrong, I'm sorry. Just tell me what it is. We can fix it. I just want to come home." Finally, just a choked sob and her name, repeated over and over until the automated voice cut me off. With each unanswered call, a memory would surface, sharp and vivid, a cruel counterpoint to the present silence. I remembered her as a little girl, maybe 5 years old, waking from a nightmare, her small body trembling. She'd cried out for me, And I had been there in an instant, scooping her up, stroking her hair, whispering, "It's okay, Mommy is here. I'll always be here." I remembered her sweet 16 party, how she'd hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack, whispering, "You're the best mom in the world." I remembered her wedding day, straightening her veil, my heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "You'll always have a home with me, Mom," she'd said, her eyes shining with tears. Where was that girl? What had happened to the woman who made those promises? Had she ever existed, or was she just a character I had written in the story of my life, a fiction I had desperately wanted to believe? The love I had felt for her, a vast and unconditional ocean, now felt like a liability, a vulnerability she had exploited with surgical precision. Each memory was a beautiful, sun-drenched photograph that had been set on fire, curling and blackening at the edges. After a week, something shifted. I called, and after one ring, a new message played. "The subscriber you have dialed has a voicemail box that is full and cannot accept new messages at this time. Goodbye." Full. She hadn't even bothered to listen to them. She had let them pile up, unheard, until there was no more room. My pleas, my fear, my love, all of it relegated to digital junk mail, deleted without a thought. I stood there with the receiver in my hand, the dial tone a flat, final drone in my ear. It wasn't just a closed door anymore. It was a brick wall. There was no way through. There was nothing on the other side but the echoing silence of my own voice. May was right. I had expected something, an explanation, an apology, even a lie. And I had received nothing. That nothing was the most brutal answer of all. It told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer her mother. I was a problem that had been solved. Life in the shelter had its own rhythm, its own brutal language of survival that I, with my polite excuse me's and thank yous, was hopelessly fluent in. I was a foreign dignitary in a land of hardened refugees, and my refinement was not an asset, it was a target. On my third day, I made the mistake of placing my neatly folded blanket at the foot of my cot, just as I would have at home. When I returned from the dreary breakfast line, it was gone. Just an empty space on the metal springs. Panic seized me. It wasn't much, just a thin, scratchy thing, but it was mine. I saw it a few cuts down, bunched up under the arm of a woman with hard eyes and a tattoo of a spiderweb on her neck. I approached her, my heart thumping. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I believe you have my blanket by mistake." She looked up at me, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across her face. "Your blanket?" she sneered, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "See your name on it, lady?" A few of the other women snickered. I felt my face flush with a hot, helpless shame. I stood there, speechless, until a gravelly voice cut through the tension. "Give it back to her, Carla." It was May, the woman from the cot next to mine. She hadn't moved, hadn't even sat up. She just lay on her side, her gaze fixed on the woman named Carla. There was no threat in her voice, just a flat, non-negotiable command. Carla's sneer faltered. She held May's gaze for a long moment, then, with a grunt of disgust, she threw the blanket onto the floor between us. "Whatever," she muttered, turning away. I picked up the blanket, smoothing it out with trembling hands. "Thank you," I said to May's back. "Don't thank me," she said without turning around. "Learn." And so, May became my reluctant teacher in the language of survival. She taught me through clipped sentences and sharp gestures, a crash course in a life I'd never imagined. "Rule 1, she said later that day, as we sat at one of the long tables, a game of checkers set up between us. "Nothing is yours unless you're sitting on it or holding it. That purse? Keep it on you when you sleep." She pointed a gnarled finger at my worn leather bag. "Tuck it under your arm." She taught me the subtle art of navigating the food line. "Never take the first bowl she offers," she instructed, her voice low. "Brenda in the kitchen, she puts the watery stuff on top. Wait a second, let her stir it. You'll get more oats that way." It was a small thing, a ridiculous thing, but here, It was the difference between a meal that stuck to your ribs and one that left you hungry an hour later. She taught me about the unspoken territories of the shelter. The corner by the television belonged to a group of younger women who were loud and aggressive. The chairs near the windows were the domain of the silent ones, the women who seemed to have retreated so far into themselves they were barely there. You and me, May said, we're in the middle. Not invisible. Not a target. That's the safest place to be. My careful speech and my quiet manners, the very things I had always considered virtues, made me an anomaly. The other women were hardened, their language coarse, their movements economical and sharp. I moved and spoke like I was still in my garden, tending my roses. One afternoon, a volunteer, a cheerful young college student, came by with a box of donated toiletries. "Good afternoon, ladies," she chirped. "Anyone need some lotion?" "Thank you, that's very kind of you," I replied, taking a small bottle. Carla, the blanket thief, snorted from across the room. "Listen to her. That's very kind of you," she mimicked in a high, fluting voice. "I do believe I'll have some lotion for my delicate constitution." The room erupted in laughter. It was cruel and sharp, and it cut right through me. I felt like a child in a schoolyard, singled out for being different. I retreated to my cot, my face burning. May followed me a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of the watery coffee. She handed one to me. "You talk like you're from a book," she said, not unkindly. "Here, that's like waving a flag that says I don't belong." "But I don't belong here," I whispered, the words a raw ache in my throat. "None of us belong here, Rose," she said, using my name for the first time. It was a small shock. "This ain't nobody's home. But we're here. And the sooner you stop acting like a visitor who's waiting for her limo to arrive, the easier it'll be." She took a sip of her coffee. "You gotta get a little dirt under your fingernails. Stop saying excuse me when someone bumps into you. Stop smiling at everyone like they're your friend. They ain't your friend. They're just next to you." It went against every fiber of my being. I was raised to be polite, to be kind, to smooth over the rough edges of the world with pleasantries. Here, those pleasantries were seen as weakness. Survival wasn't about being nice, it was about being respected enough to be left alone. It was about learning when to speak and when to be silent, when to meet someone's gaze and when to look away. It was a delicate, dangerous stance, and I was a clumsy student. But with May as my reluctant tutor, I began, slowly and painfully, to learn the steps. I started holding my spoon a little tighter. I stopped making eye contact with Carla. I learned to sit with my back to a wall. It felt like a part of me was dying, the soft, trusting part. But another part, a harder, more resilient part, was beginning to grow in its place. It was a necessary ugliness, a callus forming over a tender wound. The volunteers were a rotating cast of characters, mostly well-meaning college students and retirees looking to fill their time. They floated through the shelter with sympathetic smiles and boxes of donations, existing in a different reality from the women they were there to help. They were visitors, we were inmates. I learned to ignore them, to become part of the drab scenery, just as May had advised. But one sweltering afternoon, my ability to fade into the background failed me. I was sitting near the administrative office, a small, glass-walled cubicle at the front of the gymnasium, pretending to read a tattered copy of Pride and Prejudice. The door was slightly ajar to let in a breeze from a wheezing floor fan. Inside were 2 volunteers I recognized, middle-aged women named Carol and Diane, who always dressed in matching pastel tracksuits. They were sorting through a stack of files, their voices a low, gossipy murmur. "Another one last night," Carol was saying, her voice dripping with pity. "Looks so out of place, poor dear. Like a little lost bird." I knew, with a sinking feeling, that they were talking about me. I tried to tune them out, to focus on Elizabeth Bennet's witty retorts, but their words snagged my attention. "It's the daughter I feel sorry for," Diane said, and my blood ran cold. "Can you imagine? Having to make that choice? So stressful." "Well, from the looks of this paperwork, she didn't have much of a choice," Carol replied, the sound of rustling papers punctuating her sentence. The mother, Rose, was becoming a real burden, draining the finances, needing constant care. The daughter, Lynn, had to get power of attorney just to manage things. Power of attorney. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and cold. I remembered signing some papers a few months ago. Lynn had come over, waving a sheaf of documents, her expression harried. "Mom, it's just for the bank," she'd explained, tapping a pen impatiently on the kitchen table. "So I can help you pay your bills online." My hands are already full with Mark's stuff, and this will just make it easier to make sure nothing gets missed. Sign here, and here. I had been having some trouble with my eyesight, and the fine print swam before my eyes. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter. I'd signed where she'd pointed, my familiar signature a testament to a faith that now felt catastrophically naive. "And it's all perfectly legal," Diane said with an air of authority. The daughter used that new provision, the assisted transition statute. If a primary caregiver signs an affidavit of necessity, they can place a dependent elder in a state-approved facility for a transitional period. It's meant to prevent elder neglect, ironically. Only in this case, it looks more like, what's the word? A neat and tidy disposal, Carol whispered. A seed of pure, unadulterated poison began to sprout in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just abandonment. This was a premeditated act, a legal maneuver executed with the cold precision of a boardroom takeover. "And the house?" Diane asked. "The daughter and her husband are living in it. According to this, they've taken out a second mortgage. For renovations, it says." The air in my lungs turned to ice. My house. My beautiful little house with the climbing roses and the crooked porch step. The home I had paid off with 30 years of my late husband's pension and my own part-time secretarial work. They were borrowing against its value. My value. "Well," Carol sighed, closing a file drawer with a decisive thud. "It's a sad story, but what can you do? At least she's safe here." Safe. The word was a mockery. I was a prisoner in a holding pen, stripped of my home, my money, and my identity, and they called it safety. The seed of suspicion that had been growing within me burst into a terrible, thorny bloom of certainty. This was orchestrated. This was a coup. Lynn hadn't just dropped me off by mistake. She hadn't just abandoned me in a fit of desperation. She had planned this. She had used the law as a weapon, twisting a statute meant to protect into a tool to dispossess. She had used my love and trust as the ink to sign my life away. I closed my book, the words of Jane Austen turning to meaningless black smudges on the page. The whispers had stopped. The office door clicked shut. I sat there, frozen, the sounds of the shelter fading into a dull roar in my ears. The betrayal was no longer a vague, monstrous shape in the darkness. It had a name, power of attorney. It had a process, the assisted transition statute. It had a motive, my house, my savings, my life. It was a story told in paperwork and legal clauses, a story in which I was no longer the protagonist, but a footnote in the tale of my daughter's ambition. And in that moment, the grief that had been my constant companion curdled into something else, something harder and sharper. It curdled into rage. The rage was a cold, clean fire. It burned away the fog of confusion and helplessness, leaving behind a hard, crystalline purpose. But rage alone was not a plan. I was a 72-year-old woman with $4 and a stolen blanket to my name. Lynn had the law, the money, and the house. It was a war I couldn't possibly win on my own. Help arrived in the unlikely form of a woman named Jean, who looked more like a librarian than a warrior. She came to the shelter every Thursday afternoon, setting up a folding table and a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Legal aid. Free and confidential." She was retired, a former corporate lawyer who, as she put it, was atoning for a lifetime of defending the indefensible. She had sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found instantly reassuring. For 2 weeks, I watched her from afar. I saw her listen patiently to a young woman navigating a custody battle, and I saw her argue fiercely on the phone on behalf of another who was being illegally evicted. She wasn't like the other volunteers with their pastel tracksuits and pitying smiles. Jean looked at the women in the shelter not as victims, but as clients. Finally, I gathered every ounce of courage I had and approached her table. "Excuse me," I began, my voice faltering. She looked up, her gaze direct. "You don't have to excuse yourself. Sit down. What's on your mind, Rose?" She knew my name. Of course she did. Jean seemed to know everything. I sat, my hands trembling in my lap. And then, the story poured out of me. Not the emotional, tearful version, but the cold, hard facts I had overheard. The bus ride. The missing phone. The whispers about power of attorney and the assisted transition statute. As I spoke, Jean listened, her expression unchanging. She didn't interrupt. She simply nodded, her fingers steepled, her sharp eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence in the noisy room felt profound. "Okay," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Power of attorney is a powerful tool. It can be a lifeline, or it can be a weapon. It sounds like your daughter is using it as the latter." She pulled a yellow legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "This assisted transition statute is new. It's a loophole, frankly. Poorly written and ripe for abuse. I've been waiting for a case like this." A flicker of something that looked like grim satisfaction crossed her face. Can you help me?" I asked, the question hanging in the air, freighted with all my desperate hope. "I can look into it," she said carefully. "First, I need your full name, date of birth, and your daughter's full name. I also need your signature on a release form. It will allow me to act on your behalf and access public records." It was the first piece of paper I had signed since the ones Lynn had pushed in front of me. This time, I read every word. This time, my signature felt not like an act of faith, but an act of defiance. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet activity. Jean worked with a methodical, relentless efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. She made phone calls from her small corner, her voice a low, authoritative murmur that cut through the shelter's chaos. She spent hours on a laptop she brought with her, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She would give me small updates every Thursday. "Rose, I've pulled the property records for your address. A second mortgage was indeed taken out by Lynn and Mark Matheson 3 months ago. The lender was Sterling Trust Bank." "Rose, I've filed a request with the county court for a copy of the power of attorney document you signed. They'll try to delay, but they'll have to produce it." "Rose, I've found 2 other cases in neighboring states where this same statute was used in a similar manner. A pattern is emerging." Each piece of information was a small, sharp stone, and together, Jean was building a wall of evidence. She showed me a copy of the power of attorney. There, next to the dense paragraphs of legal text, was my signature. And beneath it, a clause I had never seen, one that granted Lynn not just the power to pay my bills, but full authority over all financial and medical decisions, including residential placement in the event of perceived incapacitation. Perceived incapacitation. 2 words, inserted with surgical precision, that had given my daughter the power to declare me unfit and dispose of me. The final piece of the puzzle was the most damning. Jean managed to get a copy of the affidavit Lynn had signed to have me placed in the shelter. She laid it on the table between us, her face grim. "You should read this, Rose." It was a litany of lies, each one more painful than the last. "My mother, Rose Franklin, has been exhibiting signs of cognitive decline and dementia for the past year. She has become forgetful, often leaving the stove on. She is prone to wandering and gets confused about her surroundings. She has become a danger to herself. Her savings are depleted, and she can no longer manage her own finances." I read it, my vision blurring with tears of rage. I had never left the stove on. My memory was as sharp as ever. My savings, a modest but comfortable nest egg I had carefully built over a lifetime, were gone, not because I had mismanaged them, but because Lynn had taken them. She hadn't just gotten rid of me, she had created a fictional version of me to justify it, painting me as a senile, incompetent burden. She had stolen my past and rewritten it to suit her future. "It's all lies," I whispered, my voice thick with a grief so profound it felt like I was choking on it. "I know," Jean said softly. "And lies on a sworn affidavit are called perjury." She tapped the paper with her pen. "This is our leverage." She thought she was just signing a form. She didn't realize she was committing a crime. Jean explained the situation clearly. "We could fight this in court. It would be long, expensive, and ugly. Lynn would paint me as an unfit, senile mother, and the details of our family life would be laid bare for public consumption. We might win back the house, what was left of the money. Or we might not. The legal system was a gamble. But there is another option," Jean said, her eyes meeting mine. "We can arrange a meeting. You, me, your daughter, and her husband. We present them with our evidence, the fraudulent affidavit, the questionable power of attorney, the second mortgage. We don't go to a judge. We go straight to them. We offer them a choice." "What choice?" I asked. "They can either face a lawsuit for financial exploitation of the elderly and perjury, which could lead to criminal charges," Jean said, her voice as sharp as glass, "or they can agree to our terms. We won't get everything back, Rose. The money they've spent is gone. But we can negotiate a settlement. And more importantly," she leaned forward, her expression serious, "you get to face them. You get to say your piece. Not as a victim, but as an equal. Sometimes, that's worth more than all the money in the world." A meeting. The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through me, followed by a surge of grim resolve. To see her again. To face the person who had done this to me. It was the one thing I feared most, and the one thing I now knew I had to do. This was never just about the money or the house. It was about the truth. It was about taking back the story of my life that she had tried to steal and rewrite. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a small, sterile conference room at Jean's old law firm, a place of polished mahogany and hushed, expensive silence. It felt a world away from the echoing gymnasium and the smell of bleach. May had helped me get ready, a silent, steady presence at my side. She had given me a crisp, clean blouse from the donation bin that actually fit, and she had brushed my hair until it shone. "Remember who you are, Rose," she'd said, her hand on my shoulder. "You ain't the woman on that piece of paper. You're you." I walked into that room with Jean at my side, my back straight, my head held high. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but I forced my hands to remain steady, clasped in front of me. Lynn and her husband, Mark, were already there, sitting on one side of the long, gleaming table. Lynn looked thinner, her face strained. She wore an expensive-looking silk blouse, but there were dark circles under her eyes. Mark, a man who had always been full of blustering confidence, just stared at the table, his face pale and slack. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Lynn did. Her gaze was a mixture of defensiveness and resentment. There was no apology in her eyes, no remorse. There was only the cold, hard glint of a cornered animal. "Mom," she said, her voice tight. "This is ridiculous. Dragging me down here with lawyers. What do you want?" The sound of her voice, the casual, dismissive tone, sent a fresh wave of hurt through me. But I didn't let it show. I let Jean speak first. Jean was magnificent. She laid out the facts with the calm, irrefutable precision of a surgeon. She placed a copy of the power of attorney on the table. She placed a copy of the affidavit next to it. She placed a copy of the second mortgage application next to that. She built a fortress of paper, each document a brick in the wall of their deceit. "The document you signed to gain power of attorney, Lynn," Jean began, her voice even, "was obtained under false pretenses. The affidavit you submitted to the state contains multiple material falsehoods, which constitutes perjury. The funds you acquired from the second mortgage on your mother's home, a home you do not own, constitute financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. These are serious charges. They carry civil penalties and the potential for criminal prosecution." Mark flinched as if he'd been struck. Lynn, however, just lifted her chin, a sneer twisting her lips. She was incompetent. She couldn't handle her own affairs. "We did what we had to do." "Did you?" I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. It was the first time I had spoken. Both of them looked at me, startled. "Did you have to lie, Lynn? Did you have to write that I was losing my mind? Did you have to drain my savings account?" The expenses were piling up. She shot back, her voice rising. "Your house, the upkeep. Mark's business. We needed the capital. You were just sitting on all that equity, not using it. We were trying to build a future, our future." "And what about my future?" I asked, the question soft but heavy. What was the plan for me, Lynn? To just leave me in that place to rot? For the first time, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed her face. It wasn't supposed to be like that. It's a clean, safe place. It was a temporary solution. A temporary solution with no end date, Jean interjected calmly. A solution that involved taking her phone and cutting off all contact. "I was going to call," Lynn insisted, turning on her. "I just needed some time. Space. She smothers me. She's always needed so much, always been so dependent." The accusation, so wildly untrue, was what finally broke the dam of my restraint. I had spent my entire life being the dependable one, the one who asked for nothing. Dependent? I laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "I raised you on my own after your father died. I put you through college. I paid off my house, a house you and your husband moved into when your lives fell apart. I cooked for you, cleaned for you, watched you spend my money on expensive gadgets and designer clothes while telling me we had to be frugal. Who, exactly, was dependent on whom, Lynn?" Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Lynn just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, no lies or justifications left to offer. Jean seized the moment. "Here is our offer," she said, sliding a final piece of paper across the table. It was a settlement agreement. "You will sign the house back over to your mother, free and clear of the second mortgage, which you will be solely responsible for. You will also pay her a lump sum, a fraction of what you took from her savings. It's not everything, but it's what we are willing to accept. In exchange, Rose will agree not to press civil or criminal charges." Mark looked at the paper like it was a death sentence. He started to speak, to bluster, but Lynn placed a hand on his arm. She looked at me, her eyes cold and hard as stone. The daughter I had loved was gone, if she had ever been there at all. In her place was this stranger, this cold-eyed woman who saw me not as a mother, but as a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be overcome. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. They signed the papers. I watched Lynn's familiar handwriting flow across the page, the same handwriting I had taught her to form, now signing away her crime. There was no grand apology, no tearful reunion. There was only the scratch of a pen on paper, the cold finality of a business transaction. When it was over, I stood up. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the last time. I didn't see the little girl with scraped knees or the teenager on prom night. I saw a stranger whose choices I could not comprehend, whose heart I did not know. "I have my house back," I said, my voice steady. "And you have your future. I hope it's worth it." I turned and walked out of that room without looking back. I didn't get my money back, not all of it. I didn't get an apology. But as I walked out into the bright sunshine, with Jean by my side, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I had faced the monster, and I had not flinched. I hadn't won back my past, but I had won the right to my own future. I had walked away without her money, but I left with something far more valuable, my dignity. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that I would never, ever go back. The taxi ride back to the shelter was quiet. The settlement papers felt heavy in my purse, a tangible symbol of a victory that felt hollow and profound all at once. I had my house back, legally. But the thought of returning to it, to the rooms haunted by Lynn's presence and the fresh ghosts of her betrayal, filled me with a deep, visceral dread. It would never be home again. It was just a building, a collection of wood and nails tainted by lies. When I walked back into the cacophony of the gymnasium, May was waiting for me by my cot. She looked at my face, her gaze sharp and perceptive. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, "So? What now?" "I don't know," I confessed, the fight draining out of me, leaving a vast, empty weariness in its place. "I can't go back there. Not to that house." "Good," she said with a firm nod. "That place ain't yours anymore. It belongs to a ghost." She was right. The Rose Franklin who had tended her roses and waited for her daughter to call was a ghost. I couldn't go back to being her. The question was, who was I now? I was a woman who had been stripped of everything, who had stared into the abyss of her own daughter's heart and found nothing there. The idea of starting over at my age was terrifying. It felt less like a new chapter and more like a blank page at the end of a book I didn't know how to finish. That evening, May led me to a quieter corner of the shelter, where a small group of older women were gathered. There was a quiet intensity to their work. One woman was knitting a brightly colored scarf with surprising speed, her needles clicking like a tiny, insistent clock. Another was carefully sanding a small wooden bird, her brow furrowed in concentration. May sat down on an overturned crate and picked up a piece of driftwood and a carving knife. "This is the co-op," she said, her voice low. "The Phoenix Cooperative. We make things. We sell them down at the weekend market. It ain't much, but it's ours." She introduced me. There was Elena, the knitter, a former seamstress from Portugal with eyes that still held a spark of fire. There was Sarah, the wood carver, a retired teacher who spoke in quiet, thoughtful sentences. They looked at me, not with pity, but with a cautious curiosity. "Rose used to be a writer," May announced to the group, which came as a surprise to me. I hadn't told her that. She must have just known. Elena looked up from her knitting. "A writer? What kind of stories?" I don't write anymore," I stammered. It felt like another lifetime. "Nonsense," May grunted, not looking up from her carving. "You don't stop being what you are just because you stop doing it. Your hands remember. Your mind remembers." Over the next few days, I watched them. I watched how they shared their materials, a ball of yarn, a piece of sandpaper, without a word. I saw the quiet pride on Sarah's face when she finished a delicate carving of a tiny, perfect owl. I saw the way Elena's shoulders straightened when a volunteer complimented the vibrant colors of her scarf. They weren't just passing time. They were creating. They were taking the scraps and fragments of the world, a piece of discarded wood, a skein of cheap yarn, and making something beautiful, something new. They were taking their broken lives and building something whole. One afternoon, Sarah held out a small block of basswood and a simple carving knife. "Here," she said gently. "Just feel the wood. Don't have to make anything. Just see where the knife wants to go." Hesitantly, I took them. The wood was smooth and cool in my hand. The knife felt foreign, dangerous. I thought of Lynn, of her sharp words and cutting lies. I put the knife to the wood and made a small, angry gouge. Then another. And another. I wasn't carving. I was attacking the wood, channeling all the rage and grief that had no other place to go. And then, something shifted. My breathing slowed. My hands, instead of fighting the wood, began to follow its grain. The sharp, angry cuts softened into long, sweeping curves. I wasn't thinking about what I was making. I was just letting my hands move, letting the pain flow out of me and into the wood. After an hour, I looked down. The blocky, angry thing in my hands had taken on a shape. It was rough, asymmetrical, and deeply flawed. But it looked like a heart. A scarred, battered, but still recognizable heart. May looked over at it. "Not bad for a start," she said, the closest she ever came to a compliment. That was the day I made my choice. I wasn't going back to my old life. There was nothing there for me but ghosts and painful memories. My old life was about sacrificing, about making myself smaller to accommodate others. This new life, this terrifying, uncertain, blank page, could be about creating. It could be about building. I gave the settlement papers to Jean. "Sell the house," I told her. "Pay off the loan Lynn and Mark took out. Whatever is left, put it in a trust for the Phoenix Cooperative." Jean looked at me, her sharp eyes searching my face. "Are you sure, Rose? That's your security. No, I said, the truth of it settling deep in my bones. My security isn't a building. My security is right here. I looked over at May and Sarah and Elena, at their bent heads and busy hands. My security was in the shared silence, the clicking needles, the smell of sawdust. It was the choice between a lonely, haunted freedom and a shared, purposeful struggle. I was choosing freedom, the real kind. The kind you have to build for yourself, one piece at a time. Life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated not by the clanging bells of the shelter, but by the quiet hum of creation. The Phoenix Cooperative became my world. We worked in our corner of the gymnasium, a small island of industry in a sea of listlessness. We were a strange and wonderful collection of broken women. Elena, whose son had sold her apartment out from under her, knitted her grief into intricate lace patterns. Sarah, a widow whose stepchildren had immediately cast her out, carved her loneliness into the smooth, silent bodies of wooden birds. And I wrote. It started small. May had challenged me. "You're a writer," she'd said one day. So write. We needed little cards to attach to our crafts at the market, something to tell the story of the piece. For one of Sarah's carved owls, I wrote, "Carved from a fallen branch, this owl carries the wisdom of the wood. He has seen seasons change and storms pass. He is a silent guardian, a reminder that even in darkness, there is sight." Sarah read it, her eyes welling up. "No one's ever said my work was wise before," she whispered. Soon, I was writing a small story for every item. For Elena's vibrant scarves, this scarf was knitted with the colors of a sunrise over the sea, a promise that even after the longest night, the light will return. For May's driftwood sculptures, found on the shore after a long journey, this piece of wood has been shaped by the wind and the waves. It holds the story of the ocean, a story of resilience and constant change. The words flowed out of me, words I thought had dried up forever. I wasn't writing about my pain, not directly. But every story I wrote about resilience, about beauty found in broken things, about the promise of a new dawn, was my own story. It was my own heart, healing itself one sentence at a time. Our little table at the Saturday market began to attract attention. People weren't just buying a scarf or a carving, they were buying a piece of a story. They would pick up an item, read the little card I had handwritten, and their expression would soften. They saw not just the craft, but the soul behind it. An owner of a local gift shop, a kind woman named Maria, stopped by our table one week. She bought several pieces and then looked at me. "I love these stories," she said. "Have you ever thought about collecting them?" That night, for the first time in years, I took out a notebook and a pen, not to write a description for a craft, but to write for myself. I wrote about the smell of bleach and fear. I wrote about the cold finality of a dial tone. I wrote about the unexpected kindness of an old hand offering me a cup of watery coffee. I wrote about the feel of a carving knife in my hand, and the slow, painful process of carving a broken heart out of a block of wood. I wrote the truth. The money from the sale of my house came through. After paying off the fraudulent mortgage, there wasn't a fortune left, but it was enough. True to my word, the money went to the cooperative. We were able to buy better quality yarn for Elena, better tools for Sarah, and a small, used van to transport our wares. But most importantly, we were able to put down a deposit on a small rental house. It wasn't a big house. It was a modest, slightly crooked bungalow with a peeling porch and a yard full of weeds. To us, it was a palace. There were 3 small bedrooms, one for me, one for May, and one for Sarah and Elena to share. For the first time in almost a year, I had a door I could close. I had a bed that wasn't a metal cot. I had a window that looked out onto a garden, albeit a wild one. The first night in that house, none of us slept much. We sat in the small living room, drinking tea, the silence comfortable and deep. We didn't need to talk. We were home. We had built this. Out of the ashes of our old lives, we had found not just shelter, but a home. We had found not just survival, but a purpose. I found a new kind of belonging, one that had nothing to do with blood or obligation. It was a belonging forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. We were a patchwork family, stitched together with threads of loss and resilience. Elena would cook huge pots of fragrant stew, filling the house with the smells of her childhood in Lisbon. Sarah would sit on the porch, patiently teaching me how to tell the difference between a sparrow's song and a finch's. May, in her gruff way, was the anchor, the one who would fix a leaky faucet with a piece of wire and a stern look, the one whose quiet presence made us all feel safe. I was earning my own income, small as it was. The feeling of a customer handing me cash for something I had created, a set of note cards with my stories, a framed piece of prose, was a thrill I had never known. It wasn't Lynn's money, or my late husband's pension. It was mine. I had earned it with my own mind and my own hands. Each dollar was a tiny declaration of independence. My life was finally, truly, my own. Months have passed. It is late summer, and the air is soft and warm. I am sitting on the porch of our little house, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands. May is beside me in her rocking chair, not rocking, just sitting, watching the sky as the sun bleeds across it in strokes of orange and purple. The weedy yard has been tamed. We now have a small, thriving vegetable garden and a row of triumphant sunflowers standing tall against the fence. The house is no longer crooked, it has settled into its own comfortable, lived-in posture. Inside, I can hear the soft click of Elena's knitting needles and the low murmur of the television where Sarah is watching a nature documentary. The smell of garlic and tomatoes, the beginnings of Elena's dinner, drifts out to join us on the porch. These are the sounds and smells of my life now. They are the sounds of peace. A letter came last week, forwarded by Jean. It was from a small publisher in the city, the one the gift shop owner, Maria, had sent my stories to. They want to publish a collection of my work. They want to call it the Phoenix Chronicles. They are offering me a modest advance. It's not enough to make me rich, but it's enough to buy a new set of tires for the van and a proper workbench for Sarah. It is more than enough. I think about Lynn sometimes. Not with the sharp, tearing pain I used to, but with a kind of distant, sorrowful pity. I wonder if she is happy in the life she stole to build. I wonder if the new renovations and the expensive appliances fill the hollow spaces in her heart. I picture her in my old house, a place that is no longer mine, and I feel nothing. No anger, no desire for revenge. The bitterness has been scoured away, replaced by something cleaner, something lighter. It is the profound relief of indifference. She thought she was sending me to a hotel. In a strange, twisted way, she did. She sent me on a journey that I never would have taken on my own, a journey that forced me to strip away everything I thought defined me, mother, homeowner, widow, and discover the person who was left underneath. The person who was left was a survivor. She was a creator. She was a friend. She was me. May clears her throat, the gravelly sound pulling me from my thoughts. Good sunset, she says. It's the most she's said all afternoon. Yes, I reply, taking a sip of my warm tea. It is. We sit in comfortable silence, two old women on a porch, watching the day come to a close. There is no grand fanfare, no dramatic conclusion. There is only this quiet moment, this earned peace. The bus ride ended in a place of fear, but the journey led me here. The hotel was never waiting for me, but this quiet, simple, beautiful life, was. And it is more than I ever could have hoped for. My life is finally, truly, my own again.